one of the reasons why it's important to create that department is because just in the last year and a half, as these alternatives are taking flight, the work of public safety is spreading from the police department and 911, which was a coordinator's department, into many departments. So today and in the future, that work is going to land across 7 different departments. You could leave it like that. It's working right now because it's new, but I think in a couple years, it's going to be really, really important to have that work all under one umbrella. And most importantly, accountable to one single commissioner. Because a lot of people are talking about accountability at the elected level, but not considering the implications of having this work spread across multiple department heads.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
Okay, this is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. My guest today to talk about Question 2, the Public Safety Charter Amendment in Minneapolis, is Andrea Larson, who is a former Deputy City Coordinator. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to focus entirely in this episode on Question 2 in the Public Safety Charter Amendment. You tell us first what your role was with the city, what you worked on, how long.
Sure. So, and I left the city in the beginning of September. I was at the city for 6 years. That entire time I was in the city coordinator's office. The city coordinator is like a mix between a city manager and a chief operating officer. And so the office is really responsible for supporting the management and administration of the city. And in my role, I oversaw a couple of teams that helped the city think about how to plan and track and report and innovate its work. I oversaw the performance and innovation team, which is where most of the public safety work that I'll be talking about today happened. Continuous improvement, policy research and analysis, and then resilience. And I worked on the Office of Performance and Innovation specifically was working on alternatives to police response since 2019. And so I've spent a couple of years working on that project.
That includes things like the 911 work group where city is trying to parse out different types of calls that don't require an armed law enforcement response, right?
Yep. Yeah. So actually at the end of 2018, City Council directed the coordinator's office to basically explore alternatives to police response. And the question was, can we respond without police? What types of calls would make sense to respond without police? And if we did, who would actually provide that response? And so in 2019, I led the 911 MPD work group, and that included 911, MPD, the fire department, the attorney's office, the Office of Violence Prevention, a member from the Promise Zone, 6 community members who all got together and had 4 meetings where we basically analyzed the data and made some decisions around which calls does it make sense to explore alternatives to police response. And then in 2019, that work was handed off to the Office of Performance and Innovation, who used design thinking process. And they have formulated their own version, which is an inclusive design process to basically say, like, what within these call types, and we decided to look at report only calls and behavioral health calls or mental health calls or they're coded as what's called EDP, or emotionally disturbed person calls. That's all one category. And so for those two call types, the OPI team did a lot of work to look at, like, what is it that end users want and need, and then how do we? And they did a tremendous amount of community engagement to try to understand that. And then they looked across the country at various models. They looked at the city's capabilities to see what we are able to do and are not able to do. And then they put forward a set of recommendations at the end of 2020 about options for piloting and moving forward with various alternatives to police response. And now they are in the process of implementing those alternatives.
So when people say that there is no plan, the city's been working on stuff adjacent to the Department of Public Safety, this question too, for years before George Floyd was killed by MPD. Like, this work has been ongoing.
Yeah, the there's no plan narrative is inaccurate in many ways, and then there is some accuracy to it. And so it's inaccurate insofar as there are so many very, very, very thorough, well thought out plans that have been developed among staff, including MPD and 911 and OPI, and many others, that outline in detail, like, what is this work? How is it going to happen? And so the really hard work around planning is well underway. The plan that I think people want to see is an org chart. And that doesn't exist right now. And so, for me personally, because I know intimately how detailed the actual plans of doing the actual work are, I'm okay voting yes, knowing that the thing the city has to do is make an org chart. And so there is there are so many plans in place about what it would mean to have a response, and really that doesn't even include all the work around prevention. But this public health approach has really been outlined, articulated. It is publicly available. Both of these teams report regularly to the Public Health and Safety Committee. But it is hard to find. It is not publicized. It doesn't make for a sensational headline, so it doesn't make the news media. And it's really frustrating as someone who worked at the city to watch that and the work of the people leading those teams go really unacknowledged.
Yeah. Should we zoom out and talk about the city's org chart?
Yeah, I usually start there because really the first and second ballot questions are about the org chart. And I think a lot of people haven't actually looked at it before. And so the city is structured in that the mayor and the council have sort of this shared authority over a set of chartered departments. And the chartered departments are called that because they are written into the city's charter, which is like the city's constitution. One of the chartered departments is the coordinator. That's the office that I was in. But under the coordinator, there are a number of coordinator departments. And those, the way you can think about charter and coordinator departments, like, this is a loose guideline. It's not always true, but chartered departments interface and provide services to residents, and coordinator departments help make sure that those chartered departments can function and run smoothly. So coordinator departments are departments like finance and HR and communications and IT. But the coordinator departments also include some externally facing work like 311 and 911 and neighborhood and community relations. And so what the second question does is basically create a new chartered department. And there's been a lot of questions about, like, if all of these changes are already happening, why do we actually have to pass this amendment? And it is because if you want all of this work to be coordinated in one place, and you want that place to be a department that has the full, authority that other charter departments have and is accountable directly to the mayor and the council, then it has to be a charter department and it has to be written into the charter. One of the reasons why it's important to create that department is because just in the last year and a half, as these alternatives are taking flight, the work of public safety is spreading from the police department and 911, which was a coordinator's department, into many departments. So today and in the future, that work is going to land across 7 different departments. And that's like direct response to residents when they call 911. And, I think you could leave it like that. It's working right now because it's new. But I think in a couple of years, it's going to be really, really important to have that work all under one umbrella. And most importantly, accountable to one single commissioner. Because a lot of people are talking about accountability at the elected level, but not considering the implications of having this work spread across multiple department heads and what accountability looks like at the staff level if that work remains spread out across these different departments.
One of the things I'm not sure exactly what people mean when they say we don't need question 2, we can do this already. I think maybe what they mean is you put it under MPD, like put the chief in charge. Like I think most people, maybe, I don't know, I shouldn't assume, but it makes sense to me that you want all these things integrated. Why? I think the council maybe doesn't trust MPD to put this in MPD. They've been trying to extract things from MPD, and I can understand that perspective too. But why not just put it all under MPD, integrate it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 options. You either put it all under MPD or you create a coordinator department, because they could do that without changing the charter. And you create a coordinator department. I think the issue with putting it all under MPD is the concerns people have with the culture of the department and how that will impact the work happening in other areas. And I do think there's some issues with trust that the work will get done, and trust that it will be done, that the work of alternatives will be given, and prevention would be given as much attention as the traditional policing work.
Right. And if you left it spread out between the existing MPD and then created a coordinator department, that wouldn't really be integrated either.
No, and also, like, the coordinator is like a city administrator, right? They're a manager. And the current interim and the prior coordinator were CFOs. And you'd have to like significantly change the role, job description, scope of work for that coordinator role to have all of that public safety work rolling up into that department. And so that just really doesn't make sense. And I don't think anyone really wants that. But technically you could do it, but you wouldn't want to.
So what does question 2 do? Let's talk about what question 2 actually does.
Yeah. So it creates that chartered department, and basically changes the reporting structure. I think in practice, MPD, is accountable to council today. The chief is selected by the mayor and approved by the council, just like the other chartered department heads. And the budget is proposed by the mayor and approved by the council, just like the other chartered department heads. And I do think the chief in practice is accountable to the council members. Like when they call and ask questions or call, like I think the chief, maybe council members would disagree with this, but feels accountable to them and their constituents. And so in my opinion, and this is just, I'm venturing into like my opinion,
Right.
is that it codifies what is happening in practice today already and what other chartered departments have in place. And then the third thing it does is removes the minimum staffing levels.
Which is an unusual thing in Minneapolis. Other cities, I think maybe San Francisco had a minimum staffing thing, but it's a rare thing to find a minimum staffing provision like this in other places.
Yeah, and I haven't done a lot of benchmarking work on understanding that, but I do know that the this is where the prevention or the alternatives work and the amendments sort of intersect, right? Because a lot of people are, I've heard people say like, I don't want a social worker to respond, so I'm going to vote no. And the reality is like that work is already underway and it's going to continue to happen. And in terms of like continuing to explore opportunities for alternatives. And so like people are not voting on that. They're not voting on if we should or shouldn't have an alternative response. Like it's going to happen in like a month. The contract is signed, the budget is there, people are being hired. Like that is not a valid reason to vote no because it's already happening. Removing the minimums, the challenge with funding alternatives is that it pulls work, it takes work off of MPD's plate. And if you can't move the dollars that go along with that work, it makes it really hard to fund the alternatives. And the only other two ways to fund the alternatives work is by increasing the levy, which like there's not a lot of political appetite to, they try to increase that as little as possible every year. Some people might not believe that when they look at their taxes, but I do think they try. And then whatever incremental dollars the city gets has to be divvied up among all of the, departments, or they have to cut services in other departments. And the city just has not a very good track record of doing that. And so in my opinion, what removing the minimums does is allows greater budget flexibility, and it provides the option to accelerate the alternatives work. And if we don't remove the minimums, then the dollars will kind of drip into alternatives and you'll have sort of slower incremental change versus, the ability to have more rapid change in the response.
And just a note for listeners on the way the budget works. The mayor proposes a budget at a certain amount. The Board of Estimate and Taxation sets the maximum levy. And by the time it gets to the city council, they don't have an option to say, well, the mayor set the budget at this level, let's add $5 million to it. They can't add $5 million without cutting $5 million in a bunch of other places.
That's right. So then they're just moving dollars around, and the minimums sort of lock us into a certain budget amount. And we're locked into that whether the staff are there or not.
So you're funding officers who don't exist.
Correct.
So what are we not voting on? There's a lot of myths floating around.
Yeah. I think the most important thing that we're not voting on is whether alternatives are going to happen. Like it's happening. And so whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't really matter. You're not voting on that. And we're not voting on the budget. That happens through you just explained, through the annual budget cycle. We are voting on some budget flexibility, but not on the budget itself. And this is not a vote to abolish police. There are state statutes that outline the kinds of calls that peace officers or police officers have to respond to. And so we cannot, we have to have police and they have to respond to those calls. That was one of the very first questions that we had to have answered in the 911 MPD work group. And so, I know there's been a lot of conversation among different initiatives and campaigns, but the city staff working on this were never, ever under the assumption that we wouldn't have police. We can't not have police. The state dictates that we must.
Right.
And so we are not voting on abolishing the police.
What about the chief? Does it fire the chief? It doesn't fire the chief, but tell me why it doesn't fire the chief.
Leading question there. No. The chief, I mean, in practice, like every department has a department head, and then they have multiple divisions and division heads. And so, like, thinking about public works, right? There's the department head who's in charge of public works, and then there are multiple divisions. There's water, and there's someone who's the person in charge of water. There's streets. There's the waste stream, and there's individual people who are in charge of those different divisions. And so, practically speaking, you would have a commissioner of the department, and then you would need to have someone in charge of MPD still. I guess, sure, the commissioner could choose to find someone else for that role. It would probably be appointed and whatever, but passing it doesn't immediately fire the chief of police.
So, some of this bleeds into the conversation around question 1 and the 14 bosses thing. You've worked at City Hall. Maybe, do you have a perspective on that? The chief says it would be, did he use the phrase intolerable or unbearable?
Unbearable.
Something to that effect, implying that if this passes, he just won't come back. It's not a system he wants to work under. Meanwhile, the fire chief operates under that system. The public works director operates under that system. It's the way the city works for other departments, but he doesn't want to work that way. Do you have an insight into that?
I have my own perspective on it, and I'll certainly share that. Like I said, I don't know enough about his day to day to be able to comment on what his personal experience would be. But like I said, in practice, working with MPD, like they're accountable to all the constituents of the city, and that it makes them accountable to all the elected officials. And so, and you're right, every other chartered department functions like that. I will say it is very, very, very complicated, and it is difficult to work in that environment. And, to be honest, I was a pretty strong yes on one supporter. And just in the last couple of weeks, I'm reconsidering that. I think I've always been a huge proponent. After my first year at the city, I was like, when I leave the city, I am going to lead an initiative to have a city manager. Like, this is crazy. And I still believe, like, my very first choice would be to have a city manager. I think I've been leaning toward yes on one because, having a strong mayor is like a version of that. And I wonder if that's good enough. And I don't know if it is, right? Like, and I'm becoming a little undecided on this, but a mayor, the reason, the characteristics and traits that mayors are elected for are not the same as the characteristics and traits that a really good, strong manager is hired for. And really that role should be providing guidance and support and development for department heads managing their workload, doing business planning, managing their performance, holding them accountable. Like that's the role that's the job of a really good manager. I don't know that that's the job. I don't know if a mayor can do both of those things well. Um, and so, but I also don't know how long I'm like, I don't know when this is going to come on the ballot again and how long I'm willing to wait. So I'm kind of in the middle um, on that one. But it is true that, I mean, it's a complicated structure to operate in, and we operate in it. Like it's not impossible. It's very possible. I think like we made it. The teams that I led made a ton of progress, especially on this public safety work over the last couple of years, and we're operating in the same environment.
So, did you read that Star Tribune commentary from former council members Lilligren, Glidden, and Peter Wagenius
I
about
didn't.
question one? They
No.
said they made a case that it would open up a situation where the mayor could bully council members using their power over staff to basically take retribution against council members that aren't allied with the mayor. Do you see that as a potential problem?
If one passes.
Yeah, if one
I mean,
passes.
yeah, it's a strong mayor.
Yeah.
Yes, like they would be. I mean, there's a lot of trade-offs, right? Like you, the huge problem with a strong mayor, and this is the real downside to that versus a city manager, is that like, we can elect some really weird people sometimes. And if you get a weird person in that role with a lot of ability to make change and power to make change, they could really wreak havoc. Um, I also I do wish I think the I do wish we could say, you know, look at the last 4 years, like you and you alone are accountable for all of this. And we really can't do that today um, on like a lot of things that happen in the city. And so that's one level of accountability that I sort of like crave. But it comes at a cost, which is that you might let someone come in and do some really crazy stuff for 4 years. And does it feel good at the end to say, wow, you screwed up? Like, is that worth it? I don't know.
Yeah, even aside from like the crazy person scenario, there's a potential you get efficient at blocking progress. Like you could have efficiency in service of making good things happen. What if the mayor doesn't agree with those things happening and just finds a way to roadblock it?
Absolutely. And efficiency, I mean, this is a great point, right? Like I I want more sort of accountability or line of reporting for efficiency's sake as a staff person. I mean, I think this gets into a bigger conversation about like how efficient should government be? Like, do you really want government making lots of really fast changes, or do you want public discourse and debate and dialogue over changes that have huge and significant impacts on, an entire population of people? And so it's hard for me though to take off my like, I'm a city employee, I'm trying to get stuff done hat and know like all of my former colleagues who are trying to get things done for what I do believe. And when I look back on my time at the city, like there are things that could have moved a lot more quickly, should have moved a lot more quickly. Some of those things should have taken the time that they did, even though it was inefficient and frustrating, because I really don't think we want government making like super fast decisions.
So another thing that you will hear often is this 30-day thing. Like come December 2nd, it's all up in the air. It's a mystery. Will police still be here? How is the city council going to go from no plan to having this entirely fleshed out in 30 days? What is the response to that?
I mean, this is going to sound really crass, and I understand that this, I understand the current state of our city and how very real the uptick in crime and violence is. But the plan that needs to be put in place in 30 days is an interim commissioner named, and then like the thing they need to do is make an org chart. And I just am not, I understand people don't have trust in government, but like I know the people who would be working on that. I know the staff that would be informing that. And I really trust that they can make an organizational chart in 30 days. And the council tried to do this in May. And I think, while that wasn't approved, it's like a pretty close estimation of what people could expect to see in the 30 days following. But all the rest of the work, all the other plans for like who's going to respond, how are we going to transition that work, who's going to be dispatching it, what are the response plans, like that all of that hard work is already underway. That doesn't need to be done in 30 days.
So when you say they tried to put together the org chart in May, did that have something to do with the ethical concerns about getting behind question 2, appearing to support one side
Yep.
of this charter amendment?
Yep. Yeah, and staff had previously in the year asked to start working on a plan, and they were told, no, we're not going to dedicate resources to something that hasn't passed yet. That was early in 2020. Council then attempted in May, and some staff kind of tried again in the summer. And then, of course, that turned into the explanatory text saga. And it, I think we had a chance to do some of that planning work in early 2020 before it was quite so political, and then got really legal and political, and staff really couldn't then work on a plan at that point.
It's a bizarre situation to have the chief in uniform campaigning against question 2, which he shouldn't be doing. It's against the rules. It's against ethical rules. The city council was warned off of pursuing this plan, and the chief is attacking the fact that he says there is no plan. But the truth is, the city attorney's office warned the council off of doing any work to formulate the plan. I don't know. It's bizarre. I don't know if the public understands that.
Yeah, and I think again, it's important to say what the plan is, and the plan is an org chart. And if I was a department head and I didn't know what was gonna, like, if I was gonna be sort of placed under another commissioner and what that would look like, I'd maybe anyone who's worked in an organization knows that if you make changes to an org chart, people like lose their minds, right? I mean, it's really scary and unnerving for people. And, I hear a lot of people like, we don't want to lose the chief. I think there's the people who we're not hearing from, and the people who I worry about leaving are the people, if this doesn't pass, are the people who are actually doing the change work that everyone said that they wanted. And that is the leaders in charge of prevention and alternatives. And generally staff tend to be very quiet during election years because they have to work with all the electeds equally. They have to work with each other and other employees. But I think it's important for people to have available to them the perspective of staff, which is why I'm sharing this, tasked with implementing the change that people said they wanted. And the two people leading this work have decades of experience in public safety and criminal justice policy and systems change and development and implementation of new policies, initiatives, and programs that are intended to like fundamentally change how we think about public safety and, more importantly, prevent situations like what resulted in George Floyd's murder, which is to not have police there at all for a nonviolent call. And one of the leaders, in this area worked in corrections, prisons, is nationally recognized for her work. The other person led the entire juvenile justice reform at the state level. They're like major players when it comes to legal and the legal and criminal system. And they're Black leaders too, who are just as prominent in their community as the chief. The teams they've hired have significantly higher percentage of Black and people of color on staff than most other departments and teams at the city. The leaders are paid probably half as much as the chief. Their budget accounts for 2.5% of the entire MPD budget. They've done years and years of research and engagement with residents, really focusing on not prominent leaders in the community, but people who are actually using, willingly or not, city emergency services. And these folks are under the same amount of scrutiny, but we don't hear from them. We're relying on them to do the change, but we don't hear from them. We're not willing to fund them. We're not worried about what their structure is going to be like or how hard maintaining this current system is going to be. No one's asking to hear them in a press conference. It's so frustrating to watch, and so frustrating to not see them get the support when they are the reason that we are seeing the progress that we are in public safety.
Well, I'd love to hear from them at a press conference, but I think it's against the ethics rules. They can't.
They
that
can,
we know.
and they can share information about the work that they're doing, but yeah, they can't opine on question 2, and they wouldn't want to. Maybe they'd want to. I shouldn't say that, but because they have to be really careful about how they lean, and especially because they're really dependent on elected officials, on other departments to get their work done. And that's fine, but it just means that work is really tenuous. And again, like, this is the work that everybody last year was saying, why aren't we doing more of this? Why aren't we doing more of this? And it's like the fire has gone out from under people, but these folks are still in there doing that hard work, and they're totally unrecognized.
The mayor says both and all the time. He's the both and on public safety mayor. And it feels to me like question 2 is a both and charter amendment. Like at a certain point, you have to fund the and. If you're not willing to fund the and, then you're not really both and.
Yeah. And again, I think it's the pace of change. Like, the and is happening already and it's getting a little bit of funding, but for some perspective, like, alternatives has $3 million, prevention has around $5 million, and MPD has $180 million. And so when you think about shifting how we think about public safety, that can trickle in over time if we leave the minimums in place, and it'll get up, $1 million here and there in a good year. Or you can release some of that budgetary burden or restriction rather, and accelerate the ability to transition that work and the budget over to alternatives and prevention. And that, to me, it's not about, they're both and, but it's like, how quickly do you want and are you okay with it taking like decades to move $1 million at a time? Or do you want a faster pace of change?
Right. Do you have a long-term sense regarding the pace of change? Like, what does this look like a year, 2 years, 5 years from now? I think it's going to remain incremental. As somebody who has watched budget fights for a while, it's always arguing over a few $1 million here or there, 10 officers, 5 officers in MPD.
Mm-hmm.
I see that kind of fight just continuing. It's just that we'll have the freedom to have that fight a little more. it won't necessarily be successful. Like there's a lot of roadblocks ahead still for this change, even if we do change the charter.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I like, so let's say, I mean, these behavioral health teams are going to start responding. There's two teams, two people in two teams operating 24/7, covering the whole city geography. And it's, technically a pilot, although they've received ongoing funding. So it's a pilot to see how we're going to do it, not if we're going to do it. And the my guess is that they're going to start operating, and based on what we've seen in other cities, like police, Denver launched a similar program in their first 6 months. Police calling in the behavioral health teams accounted for 30% of their call volume. Police would show up on the scene and just say, like, this is not a criminal or violent situation. This person's experiencing a mental health crisis. And, Denver was like, we're not even scratching the surface on the number of calls that we could be responding to. And I think the city is going to be in a really similar situation. Like, I think we're going to find out that these teams are needed and desired at so many more calls than what they're going to have the capability to respond to right away. And I think the same thing goes, like 311 right now is not 24/7. They're not operating on the weekends. The 311, the training program for 311 is really intensive. The 311 employees are really, really, really good at what they do. They know a ton about the city. And I think that they could be, outside of the report only calls, I could see more work shifting to 311 and them opening 24/7. And as we get information as we're running these pilots, like we're going to be able to, the OPI team and other teams are going to be able to come back and have the data to say, hey, we need to double we need $3 million more to meet the call volume. And it's a question of like, are they going to get $1 million of that, or are they going to get $3 million of that? Right. And I think if 2 doesn't pass, they'd be more likely to come with recommendations and have small portions of their recommendations funded. I think if 2 does pass, it'd be more likely that they'd have bigger portions of their recommendations funded. And it probably won't be a light switch. Like, MPD still has to be, they still have to be there because the providers, if providers can't respond to calls, like they're going to rely on MPD. And it would have to be, the behavioral health provider would have to hire, that would take time. Like it's this sort of like transition that needs to happen. It's not a light switch. But like I said, again, I think it's about accelerating the pace of change and the ability to meet the need that I can see the teams being able to articulate very clearly here as the pilots progress.
Yeah, it's almost a question of political will and what the voters are telling people they want. It's not only about electing a council who will implement some of these changes and a mayor who will support it. It's vote yes on 2 to send the message, yes, we want more of this. You vote no, you're sending the message, we want less of this.
Yeah, we want it slower, or, and I do think part of an undercurrent there is like, we don't trust that you can handle that pace of change. And that's valid, right? Like there's just not a lot of trust in government. And I don't know that the city's done a lot to earn the trust of residents. And at the same time, and I think that's really fair and valid. And I don't want to discount that. But like I don't think leaning into the status quo is going to make that any better or prevent situation, George Floyd's murder.
Yeah. I know you've been in your role as a former deputy city coordinator. Have you had luck talking to people and changing people's minds on this stuff?
Yeah, generally, I've had a few like neighborhood and community meetings, um, and and I have I've had mixed responses from people. Nobody I've talked to has seen the city's org chart, and that just like my biggest concern and one of the reasons why I'm like pretty active on this is I just am so worried that people don't actually know what they're voting on. And nobody I've talked to about this has looked at and then understood the city's org chart. And we are voting on the city's org chart. And so that no matter how people are voting, people are like, wow, I had no idea. This is super helpful, right? That's been really helpful. I have heard a few people say that they are voting yes after hearing more about the distinction between what kind of plan it is that we're talking about, to hear about the thorough work already happening around alternatives and prevention, to think about like the remaining work as being an organizational chart and structure. And for a lot of people who are undecided that I've spoken to, or who are maybe leaning yes, like that pretty firmly like nudged them into the yes camp, because there is so much more structure and order and thoughtfulness than what anyone is presenting to the work that's already happening.
Is there anything you think we have not covered?
The only thing I'd add that I do get a lot of questions or see a lot of questions about is because we are voting on making some and accelerating some of that change. And I hear a lot of people worried about risk to responders. And I will say that the city, we did a study a couple years ago on call disposition. So to try to track like, well, how often do calls, the big concern really early on was like, you couldn't ever send anyone but a police officer because something could happen. The call could escalate. And so we looked at the data to try to figure out like, does that happen? Is that true? How often does it happen? How big of a risk is it actually? And basically found out that the city has like really, really amazing dispatchers. They're incredibly good and accurate at identifying what is happening on a current call. And so we analyzed the call disposition. So what happens when a call comes in and the dispatcher codes a call, and then how is it coded when the officer arrives? And sometimes those match and sometimes they don't. But the large majority of the time, the disposition matches. So the dispatcher was able to accurately define what kind of call it was. And when it did change, especially for nonviolent calls, the calls changed from one nonviolent disposition to another nonviolent disposition. And so I just think it's really important to note that as we think about what it means to accelerate change, it's so important to consider like what risk really is, and if there really is a risk. And I think we found that for nonviolent calls, there really isn't. And pulling that work off of MPD's plate just allows them to take on and handle and spend more time at the kind of calls that are violent or where there is criminal activity going on. And I think that's a really important thing to consider as we think about what an org chart and what an organizational structure looks like to support like a full public safety response.
Okay, thank you, Andrea Larson. I really appreciate it when somebody uses their experience at City Hall and goes out and helps people understand the way government works, because I agree with you. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in this election year, and it scares me too.
Yeah.
It's got me feeling down. But,
well, I hope that this helps, and thank you for having me and hosting this.
Yeah. My guest has been Andrea Larson. This has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.